We usually give it a moment. We'll give it a minute here. I'll cut it off once we are live, but just a minute for viewers to start training. Cool. All right, I'm going to get started, and we'll go from there. All right. Okay. Welcome to the latest Straight Up Hangouts. I'm Ben Friesick from Barrel Strength Design, joined today by Michael Raw, developer and proprietor of top-shelf craft plugins, such as calendars, and Marian Newlevant, freelance web developer and Twig aficionado. Today we're discussing some common errors we see in our Twig templates and the tools we have available to troubleshoot them. So, as I'll be sharing my screen and going through these, a few examples, people feel free to jump in with questions. If you're in the viewing audience, you can find a Q&A sidebar in the app and post your questions there. And feel free to do so throughout the conversation. All right, so first up, we have troubleshooting common errors in Twig. I'm going to share my screen here. I've installed the Happy Logger site, and we have a handful of common errors that I see as people get started with Twig. They run into some things. You see new people joining the community and kind of running into the same problems as they get an understanding of what's there. So let's start with one that I think is one of the most common. Is somebody's just trying to output something in a template that isn't actually there. So one example of this is here we have our Happy Logger website on the left, and on the right we have the index page, and I'm just going to modify the index page and try to output a variable that doesn't exist. And this can happen for many reasons. Sometimes it's just a misspelling. Sometimes we think we're working with one database and we're working with another database. In any case, when it happens, we get a pretty clear error message. It says variable that doesn't exist does not exist. This is a nice one because it's pretty straightforward what's happening. And one of the reasons we see this error in the form that we do is because we have dev mode enabled. So a great step to take when you're first starting up with a craft site is to go into your config folder and in the general.php set dev mode to true. I'm going to toggle this to false and refresh the page here, and we'll see that we get very different results if we have dev mode off. In this case, craft suppresses the error entirely, which is nice if you have something like this happening on your live site, because your users don't end up seeing that error. But it's not nice in that something under the hood isn't working properly that should be working properly, and it could lead to other errors or problems that you know, create issues for you down the road and are harder to troubleshoot because you didn't have clean code beneath what's going on. All right, so for this demo, we're going to have dev mode to true most of the time, and when we do that, we get this nice error screen, and we get a nice highlight of the line that Twig thinks is causing the issue.
Hey Ben, can I jump in with a comment?
Yeah, please.
So to say that craft is suppressing the error is true sometimes. In this case, the case of a variable that doesn't exist, Twig is actually handling that for us. A thing that dev mode toggles is Twig's strict variable checking. And so if Twig's strict variable checking is on, as it is in dev mode, then when you use a variable, Twig will not let you get away with using a variable that doesn't exist. But if Twig's strict variable checking is off, as it is when dev mode is off, like when you're in production, Twig will actually just sub in a null variable for anything that you try to use that doesn't exist. So in this case, we're seeing a template error when we're in dev mode, and we don't see that template error when we're not in dev mode. If there was actually an error, like a PHP error or a parsing error or something, we would see that error. It just wouldn't be as pretty if dev mode wasn't on. And so, like you say, it's a really good idea to turn dev mode on when you're in development, not because production is suppressing errors, but because with dev mode on, you can't accidentally get away with using a variable that doesn't exist. So in this case, it's not that there's necessarily an error that's being suppressed when you're in production. Twig is just sort of flubbing it for you to help you out when you're in production.
Got it. Nice clarification there, Michael. And that's set by Craft's dev. So Craft is saying, when you turn on this dev mode variable, we're going to do a handful of things in how Twig is being loaded to create these different conditions for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. All right. Yeah. So then one approach to, as we discover these errors, we can clean them up. We can make this a variable that does exist. We can delete this. Or maybe this variable sometimes exists, and what we really need to do is wrap a conditional statement around that. So one way to start cleaning up scenarios that may or may not exist in our code is to check if our variable is defined before we try to output it to the screen. So here we still have a variable that doesn't exist in our code, but when we refresh now, it's not breaking our page, and Twig isn't suppressing things for or returning nicer things for us. We're actually controlling the output more appropriately in our code. All right, so let's take this to the next step of what if the variable doesn't exist, and it's well, what if we have an entry model in our template here of the home page? So we can output something like entry.title in our template. So here we output our home page value. Now, what if we misspelled that? We get another error, this one different than the first. This variable doesn't exist, but now we're getting a completely different error, and it's a little bit harder to make sense of if you're not familiar with the tech terminology. So let's take a look at what this terminology is saying. It says craft entry model and its behaviors do not have a method or closure named titles. Now I'm happy to hear how other people troubleshoot this. I'm going to kind of just talk through a few ways of how we make sense of this situation. So first thing we have to go on is, what is a craft entry model? So if we don't know what an entry model is, we can look up craft CMS entry model, and we might find in the craft docs that, hey, here's the documentation on an entry model. An entry model has a variety of features we can output, and this gives us a list of things that we might be able to output with the entry model. So that's one step we can take to start understanding our entry model better. But as we'll find in the documentation, if we search for title, or actually we do have title. I'll get to this. We do have title. So we find title, and okay, we might have misspelled a word. Title is the one we want. So we can search in our code for the word titles and try to find that, or you know, this gives us a few hints of where we can find that issue in our code. Now, what happens if we're trying to access a custom field handle and that doesn't exist? Well, we get the same error, but we're not going to find that in our docs. When we search our custom field name, the entry model doesn't know which custom field handles we have. So we have to understand that an entry model can have custom field handles, and something we're doing in the what we're outputting isn't being output properly. So again, we can troubleshoot by either updating this to the correct name, or again adding a check if something is defined. Something is defined, don't output it. Now, what happens here is we get the same error. So how do we explain this? We're doing what we just learned. If custom field handle is defined, output our custom field handle. But now when I refresh, I'm still getting the same error. What's happening here is a little more advanced to explain, but the solution is we need to check for our custom field handle using array syntax in the conditional. And I'll give a brief overview. Michael or Marion may be able to explain it in a little better detail than me, but what's happening is the entry model, when we use dot syntax in our conditional, is not sure if this exists or not, and since you can have dynamic custom fields on your entry, it has to take a guess that it tries to take a guess of, well, maybe this is a custom field that we don't know about, and then the entry model checks for that and does a few other things and ends up assuming, well, we don't know if it exists or not, so we'll assume that maybe it exists. By updating this to array syntax, we get around that, and we tell the entry model we're specifically trying to access something that exists on the entry model, and the assumption that it might exist is never made by the underlying code, and allows us to have a conditional that helps us out there.
Yeah, basically with the square brackets it says, does it have that attribute? And with the dot it says, does it have that attribute, or is there a method, or is there a get method or an is method? It tries a whole pile of things and then gives up, as you say, decides that something's wrong versus just looking in the one place and deciding it's not defined.
Great.
Yeah,
Michael,
and I guess this would be a good time to point out that on Straight Up Craft, there is that resource page that you put together, Ben, that compares all of the different ways that you can access an attribute or a method on a variable and the different outputs that it might have, some of which are sort of wonky sometimes. So it's good for people to know that this chart exists on Straight Up Craft. I find myself referencing it quite a bit.
Yeah. So here's the page Michael's talking about. There's this was a fun one to pull together for sure. I went through every scenario, and what we do in this chart is we're checking. We basically went through all of these scenarios and tested what happens in each case. Are you going to get a true response or a false response? If the variable exists, if it doesn't exist, if it's an attribute, if it's empty. And so what we're doing is going through is custom field, we're going through is defined, just if exists, if length, if is not empty, and if is not null. So this chart walks through examples of the conditional in every different format and tries to share, what type of result you're going to get back. Because some of these more advanced, some of these trickier scenarios you run into are going to not present obvious results. And this particular array syntax was the impetus for this whole chart, actually, because it just wasn't making any sense. And so what we find is general variables work kind of as you expect, and most of the time return what you want. And then the second section looks at hashes or arrays when you have an array of content that's not an object in your code. It doesn't have methods or functions and other things on it. And for the most part, those behave as you would expect as well. And then the weird behavior starts when you're interacting with objects, such as your entry model or user model or other element models in the code. And there are a couple scenarios that you run into where non-existent attributes return true when that's not the case. And so it can lead to code that's doing something that you're not expecting it to, and so on. The simple answer, if you don't want to understand the details, is whenever you're using arrays, whenever you're using dot syntax in a conditional, use array syntax, and that should get you around the issue in most cases.
And the reason for that is that Twig, if it can't find the attribute that you're looking for, will return a null value to you. And a null value doesn't have a value, but is technically defined, which causes confusion in some cases.
My understanding is this is going to be fixed in Craft 3 as well, but that's probably some time off. So this technique will probably matter for the duration of Craft 2's existence, and maybe we'll get consistent syntax support in Craft 3.
For people who do want to understand it, somewhere in the Twig documentation there's a fairly good description of how those different things work, but I can't find it right now. So.
We can post it to the show notes later.
If I can find it, I'll do that, yes.
All right, yeah, and I'll add this link in the show notes as well. All right, so I'm going to move on to our next error. Our next error is when we try to output an object or array directly as a string when it's not a string. So quickly, let's define the term string. So if I output some text, we have a string, and that gets output nicely to the page. So string is and I don't know the technical definition of it, but it's a piece of content that can be output directly to the page using these Twig output tags. Entry title, again, is a string. It's a string of text that when we output it directly to the page, it works. And there's a lot of the different variables on your models will be strings. Now, sometimes you make a mistake in your code, and let's try to put out the first hero image on this page. We know the hero image field name is hero image, and when I refresh my page, everything blows up again, and we get this error that says object of class craft element criteria model could not be converted to string. So what does this mean? So again, we have a challenge of, if we're not familiar with this terminology, we need to understand it better. An object is a construct that has several variables or methods associated with it in our template. Element criteria model is a type of object. We can search that one again in the craft docs. This is a more advanced model, so it might be a little more confusing to get a handle on it. But the element criteria model is a model that's associated with all different elements in craft. So our entries, our assets, our users, our categories, our tags, and many other plugins add new element types to the system. So an element criteria model might refer to many different things in the system, but in all cases it refers to something that is an element. So that might give us a hint that we need to be looking for something that is an element in our code. And could not be converted to string is the real key part of this. It's saying that we're trying to output something to the page that is not able to be output to the page.
Ben, I think that it's not, an element criteria model is not something that's an element. It's something that you can get an element from.
Good clarification, yes.
Yeah, so a string is just a sequence of characters, letters, numbers, and symbols. And so we could say it's words. A string is the data type that we throw characters around in. And so when we get the error something can't be converted to string, what that really means is I don't know how to take this object and turn it into words. I don't know what that means. Whereas if we take a property of that object, that property might have a meaning that we can output in letters and numbers. But the object itself, it's not relevant to turn it into a string output.
Got it. Great. Great. So thanks for those clarifications. So one of the first steps that when I run into problems like this, I think they could kind of take two forms. One is you know where it is, and you know what you need to start doing to troubleshoot. And the other is you don't even know where it is. You just know it's somewhere on your page, and you need to start troubleshooting. So I'm going to start with I'd be happy to hear how you approach these things, Mary and Michael. So one of the first things I'll do if I run into an error like this and I don't know where it is I'll delete my whole page template. I'll just resave a blank template and refresh and confirm that, okay, my error is on this page that I think it's on. It's in this template somewhere. And then I might take another drastic step, put my whole template back and just delete the whole block and be like, okay, is it within this block of that page? And once again, my page is loading. So I've narrowed down that whatever's going on is somewhere within this block on this page. And from there, I'll make educated guesses in trying to narrow it down and really try to, maybe I'll comment out blocks of text and see if I can get most of the page loading until I've isolated what's going on down to just what I know that I have to work with. So here we've got the whole page loading because we commented out the offending factor, and now we can start deciding how do we solve this problem. Now, because we have dev mode on, we have another tool in our toolkit we can turn to, which is the Twig dump function. And the dump function in Twig is only available if we have def mode on, and we can wrap it around any variable that we're outputting, and it's going to give us a bit more information on what we're trying to output. If I refresh here, now you'll see we don't get the error while we're trying to output this. We actually get a dump of the element criteria model that is causing the issue. And this gives us a little bit more information on, okay, what are we getting back here, and what information is available in that object that we might want to be accessing.
You'll get slightly more information if you put that dump tag inside of HTML pre-tags.
All right, let's do that.
Don't lose your indentation.
There we go. Nice style. Oh, in this case, looks like the styles are still being overridden where I'm outputting it on the page. But yes, that's a good point. That does help format the output in many conditions. So this is giving us basically information about this whole element criteria model that we find in the documentation. And I'm not seeing, do we actually have is the element criteria model in the docs here? It's over in the class docs, maybe.
Yeah, it spans a couple of pages in the template docs.
Okay. Yeah, this is more a description of how it works, and
there, if you there's a link there. An element criteria model object is created. That I think gives you that link gives you the properties of an element criteria model.
Okay, that just brought us down here. So.
Oh.
All right. Well, let's see if we find it in the class docs, because. So Craft has a separate set of documentation that is auto-generated, I believe, of all of the different models, and this will give you information about a particular model and all of its attributes. We're actually going to do another hangout on what is a model, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details here on that, but in a couple of weeks we're going to do another one and explore models more specifically. We're doing it a lot here, obviously, but we'll step back and try to address it more specifically in a couple of weeks.
Ben, are you looking for find and first and last and that kind of stuff?
Well, yeah, I guess that's in the main. I wasn't looking for anything specifically as much as trying to just call out the resources.
Yeah, cool.
But I think first and are those here? Yeah. Oh yeah, here they are down here. Okay. I just didn't scroll down. So yes, so far enough down this element criteria page, we start to get some of the methods available on the model that we can use. So this is just one way to start getting more information about what we have to work with. In our case, this model isn't element criteria model. This is generally more helpful with entry models or user models or something where you have some other variables that you're trying to access directly on it. As Marion said, the element criteria model is more about helping us retrieve an element, and in this case, we're able to retrieve that element by adding something like the first tag to it, which retrieves the model itself. Now, let's take this a step further and refresh, and we'll see we get back some weird result here. We'll try to explain. So now we get back, we've called our hero, we said, oh, we know it's just one image, so we're going to call just the first image there, and we get back a string of text, but that's not right. We want an image. So what are we getting back here?
You're getting the title.
We're getting back the title, right? Yeah. Why are we getting back the title?
That's what Craft gives you if you don't otherwise specify.
So when we access some models in the system, they give us back a string because they know that they can't output a object to the template. And every model that's created has the option to say what thing they want to return as the string for that model. So in our case, our asset model is returning the title of the asset. We can now dump this version of the model, or this version of our output, and see that now we have something different than our element criteria model. We have an asset file model, and we can start to see what things our asset file model has that are part of it. It has an element ID, a locale, a body, and a handful of different things that we might want to access in our template. I don't think it doesn't have the methods here. So if we're using methods, this isn't actually. Yeah, this doesn't have the methods. It just has a lot of the attributes that we have access to. So one of those.
Once we know what kind of object we're dealing with, it's easy enough to search the docs,
Yeah.
the template docs or the class docs. Like if you click there on craft.assets, or if you go to the asset file model docs, it shows you what attributes and methods you have available to you.
Yeah. So doing this in the template is a little. Clearly, it's not the best interface. It helps you start to get information. I think the key piece of information you're going to get when you do this with a model is which model you're working with, if you don't know that. And then the more technical you want to be, you could determine other things from it. But probably best to head over to the docs afterwards, look at what you're interacting with, and this will give you a clearer picture of what other things you might want to be accessing on this. So we can find here that there's ways to access the URL if we want to get the URL back from our asset model, and that can start getting us to the data that we want to be using in the output for our code and getting around that area. If we look just below this in the template, we'll see Craft is doing just that. It's setting the variable image to the first image result, which is the asset file model. It says if that exists, we're going to output the image URL with a height of 916. And then there's a error where it doesn't output the image title. All right. Any other comments on asset or on trying to output an object directly as a string or troubleshooting such?
I want to call out that there on line 9, they did the right thing. They checked that you really do have an image and that it's not null. Because even if it's required, it might still not be there.
If somebody deletes it from the database, or
if somebody deletes it from the database, it's just not going to be there, even if it's a required field. So you should always check, because otherwise, you know, it won't be there, and it won't be there sometime when you're not expecting it not to be there.
Great. Yeah, and if we want to tie this back to this chart that we looked at previously, here we're saying if image. So we have an object. We supposedly have an object because we grabbed an asset file model.
You might have an object and you might have null.
And we might have null. So we can look here and see if we do if image, and variable refers to this short syntax of just calling out the variable name without any other conditionals. We would get true or false back. If it existed, we'd get true back.
Yeah, I think in my experience, not being able to output an element criteria model is the single most common place that this occurs, where Craft will say, I just don't know how to turn this into a string. And what really helped me when I was learning is to know that every variable that we have is representing a thing in the real world, whether that thing is a word or a number or an object, and to be able to kind of ask ourselves, okay, what does this variable actually represent? So, so an entry model represents an entry, and that's going to be, you know, an object, and the entry model's title represents, you know, the words that I gave it to have as a title, and that's going to be a string. Well, an element criteria model represents a query, represents a database query, and so so there is no, like, it doesn't make any sense to try to output that, because there is no, you know, what does that mean to output the meaning of a query? And so it's kind of like if I said, well, you know, my family is an object, so output my family into the template. Well, that doesn't make any sense. But if I said, you know, okay, what is the first member of my family? Okay, well, that's my mom. And what is, you know, the find, you know, my family dot find? Okay, well, that returns to me the members of my family, and each one of those is a person, and each person is going to have a name. And so I can expect each of the, you know, if I say my family dot find, it gives me a list of people in my family. And if I take one of those people and I say, you know, person dot name, that's going to output some words that represent my name. And so if we can kind of pause and think about what real-world thing a variable actually represents, then it starts to make sense in our head why some things can be output to a template, and other things it doesn't make any sense to do that.
Michael, are there any other variables that are representative of queries, or is element criteria model unique in the Craft world?
There are other models in Craft that don't. There are other models in Craft that don't have a really good string representation. For example, the content model that's attached to every element that represents the collection of that element's custom field content. Obviously, that model just exists to contain the individual pieces of content, and so each one of those pieces of content, each, you know, custom field value, probably has a string representation, but the content model itself doesn't. Oh, let's see. Another one might be a. I can't think of any more off the top of my head.
It's okay. Yeah, it's a.
But in most cases, especially when we're dealing with things that we would want to output in a template, like an element model, in most cases, Craft has given a TwoString method to those models, and so if we try to output them in our template, then it'll, you know, fudge something for us. Like if I try to output an entry model into my template, Craft says, okay, the string representation of this entry is its title, or the string representation of a user model is its name, or the string representation of an asset model is the file name sans extension. So in a lot of cases, Craft gives us a default string representation of an object just so that we have one. And if you want, you could go into the app folder of Craft and just search for TwoString as a method, and you'll see everywhere that, you know, Craft in the models folder, almost every class has a TwoString method, which is what you get by default if you try to output an object as a string. Most cases, Craft gives us one. I want to say the element criteria model is the only one that we would routinely accidentally output to a template that doesn't have a default string representation.
Okay, great. Thanks for that explanation. All right, I have one more common error that we can move on to, maybe. And this one is when you add code to a template that doesn't belong there, or specifically an extended template. So one that pops up time to time, and frequently see people pop up in craft Slack, kind of going like, "What's going on here?" Is when you extend a template in Twig, you're extending a base layout template that has some variables in it that you can override. Usually, we can do that via set tags or block tags. In the Happy Logger site here, we're overriding the base layout template, and in that template, what was it called? Main. Block body houses. Oh, I didn't override the right template. Layout site. All right, so we're extending the site template, and it has a block called main in it. And in our template here, we're overriding that original block main from the base layout, and we're adding content to our page. Now, sometimes you want to do something else on your page here. Maybe something unique. You just wanted to add a title above it or something like that, and you put it up here. And if we refresh, we get this error that says a template that extends another one cannot have a body. And another scenario of this might be if you had some styles you wanted to add to the page specifically. I don't know. I've seen this in various scenarios where you're trying to do something, and for whatever reason you logically conclude that it shouldn't be within the block tag. It should be somewhere else. And when this happens, we're told template extends another one cannot have a body, and what that's referring to is just anything that's outside of these body tags that's on the page. It could be a single character, it could be a mistyped something or other, but something that ultimately tries to output something on this page will trigger this error, because when you're extending another template, anything that you put on the page needs to happen within that block tag. Now, there's not much to do to fix this one. I don't know. The main thing to know is that when you're extending templates, you need to be working within the available variables for those templates. You could go, if you really needed something up here, you could go back to the base template and add another variable to work with in a different location, and we'll see that Craft does have some of those variables in Happy Logger here, or Happy Logger does have some of these. We have a body variable we can override, and I think in that base layout that's being extended, we have a footer variable that we can override. So if we really had the need for CSS on this page that we were on, we could realize, oh, we could realize or add that our parent template also had a block footer option for us to add whatever else we needed to add in the footer and get our beautiful red background. So that's pretty much that that one. Michael, Marion, do you have any comments on that one?
You can define things. You can set things outside of the block, but Correct. You can't output anything.
So we can set a variable out here, the title of our page maybe, whatever we want. That's going to work fine and be processed. The order of the processing on the page kind of goes: one, it's going to process the set tags on the page, and 2, it's going to take that extended layout and swap in all of the set tags and such that it finds. And then 3, it's going to take these block variables and insert them into that the layout that it's extending, and process any additional things it needs to. And there's another article on straight up craft if that one's an interesting topic to you about the processing order. This article goes into a lot of detail about the order that these things are happening in the case that you're trying to do more advanced things where the order gets tricky on you. All right, well, are there any other topics we'd like to discuss or debugging tools that I haven't mentioned worth bringing up in this one? Those were the 3 errors I wanted to go through.
One of my favorite ones is to dump the context. You want to try that and see what happens?
Sure, let's dump the context. So can we define context,
Well,
Marian?
underbar context is already defined, and it's humongous.
So here, I think it's under, is that it?
That's it. It's not a string.
Or we want to dump it, yes.
So you want to dump it.
When Twig spins up to parse a template, the app that Twig is running in, which in this case is craft, will define a context variable, and that context variable represents the collection of all of the variables that Twig has access to.
Exactly.
So there are some that are native variables that Twig always has access to. There's others like, if craft recognizes that you're on a route that matches an entry, craft will define an entry variable that gives you easy access to the entry that matches this route that you're on. And the way it does that is by adding that entry variable to Twig's context. And so the context basically is just the collection of all of the variables that Twig knows about that you have access to in your templates.
So let's dump this over and see what we get back. So yeah, and this is actually this is a little hard to navigate because it's so large, but maybe there's, we'll take a quick look here. So we see in our context.
What I recommend is you take that context array and you pass it through Twig's keys filter, just so context pipe keys.
All right.
And that'll cut it right down.
Yes. Great. So yeah, so this is saying that on this page that we've just loaded, Twig knows about all of these different variables. And some of it
should be there because you defined it just above, right?
Great. Yeah, so we can look through this and say entry exists on this because our home page is a single, and that single has a URL that craft knows about, and whenever craft matches a section to a URL, it provides the entry variable with the related information to us. Craft is a global variable that gives us access to many more things. Blocks is a throwback to the past, which I believe is just the same thing as craft, but was the original name or the original variable in the original product back when craft was still in beta. Now is our date variable. Our logins information here, site name and site URL are global variables. Current users, your logged in user model. That's a nice trick, Marian. So let's see if we can do this to the next level. If we do craft keys, are we going to get nothing? Or is that an array? Oh, interesting, craft. I was expecting craft to have request and various other things like that in it. Am I making a bad assumption there?
So if you access craft.request, you're actually calling an instance of the HTTP request service, which is not going to spin itself up until you request it. So Craft is kind of the web app, and it has a lot of its services tied into the variables, but it sort of lazy loads those, so it's not going to spin up a service that you haven't yet requested. Interestingly, I think if you were to dump the context and then do something in your template that used craft.request and then dump the context again, you might actually see that new variable being part of the context. I'm not actually sure about that. But in any case, once you call craft.request, then you have access to the HTTP request service and have access to all of its methods that way.
We'll see. Live coding, the best way to get nothing to work. Oh, same variable, so. But all right, well, that's an interesting tip. So sometimes when you don't know, we'll just refer back to the context keys here. We can explore the others, access another time. But this is a great way to see what's available on your page if you don't know what's available on your page. Marion, are there any other steps you take once you do this, or is it generally just to reveal top-level information?
Mostly to reveal top-level information, but sometimes it's some template that's, you know, buried in somewhere that's called from some. Oh, I was using that preparse plugin, right? And there you are, and I'm like, okay, the preparse plugin that you basically you pass it a template, and what the heck is available in that template that you're passing the preparse plugin? So I passed it underbar context, sent it through keys, sent it through join so that I got a string out of that array. And then it told me what all my things that were available there for preparse to use. And then I found the one I wanted, and so I was very pleased.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes you do run into, I know we do that with sprout fields, hidden field, and invisible fields. Like we actually have to kind of pass the context to the field in order to have access to the different variables that the field might need to process on the back end while things are saving.
Right. And if you don't have debug mode, if you don't have dump, you can just take context and pipe it through keys and pipe it through join, and then it'll come out a string the other end.
That's a good idea. Never thought of that.
So we can add our we could even like do a, let me see if this works, and then raw.
That will work.
Yeah, I could do that.
So that gets you the same. Oh, that's nice if you're in an environment where you don't have a dev mode on for some reason.
Right, and you're just trying to figure out where to get a toehold to go from there. And then you say, oh, okay, I've got a title, what the heck is that? And then you can start trying to dump that somehow or look it up or whatever.
Great. Well, if anybody in the audience has any questions, I'll give you a minute. Please post them to the sidebar there, and we'll take them in turn.
While we're collecting questions, maybe I could share a couple tools that I use a lot.
Absolutely.
That relate to what we've been talking about.
Would you like to share your screen?
Yeah, I will. So the first one is, let's see, share my screen. Yeah, hang out.
Actually, let me know if you need me to give you access to.
Yeah, so I think I've shared my screen, yeah?
Yep.
Okay, great. And hopefully you can see, read everything clearly. Okay, so the first thing that I want to plug is a plugin actually that I wrote, which is called QQ, and it adds a null coalescing Twig operator to Craft. And I've talked about this a little bit on our podcast, Keeping Up with Craft. So if you've been following that podcast, then you know the story. But PHP has this really cool operator called the Null Coalescing operator. And you can Google it and look it up in the PHP docs. But basically, it's the double question mark symbol. And the meaning of that operator is that you can string variables together with this double question mark operator, and the operator will return the first thing from left to right that is defined and not null. So in this case, if I say thing1 double question mark thing2, then if thing1 is defined and it has a value, then I get the value of thing1. But if thing1 is either null or it's not defined, then I get the value of thing2. And if neither of these things are defined, or if both of them are null, then I just get a null variable back from this operator. And I find this, they added it in PHP 7. So if you're writing PHP 7 apps, then you have access to this operator. But I just found it so useful in my PHP code that I wanted to port it into my Twig template code. And at the time, Twig didn't offer this operator, and so I wrote a plugin that added it. That operator has since, as a response to this, been added to the core of Twig. So it should be appearing in Craft soon, I hope. But in the meantime, if you install this plugin, then you have access to this, this double question mark operator. The reason that this is relevant to what we're talking about is we've been talking about, well, what happens, how do you keep yourself from running into errors when you're dealing with variables that may or may not be defined, and this is my favorite method for that. So if I'm in a template and maybe, oh golly, maybe I'm doing like my SEO meta tags, and so I might be on an entry page, in which case I have entry.SEO description. But that also might be undefined, and so maybe I have a global element, and that's my default information. And so if I don't have an entry with an SEO description, then I want to fall back to that global element and its description variable. And maybe if I'm in some context where I can't find that, then I just want to fall back to a blank string. And so by stringing variables together with the null coalescing operator, then I get whichever the first one is available that has a value. And behind the scenes, what this operator is doing in Twig is just temporarily, just for this expression, invoking Twig's ability to flub in a null variable for a variable that it can't find. So I'm deactivating Twig's strict variable checking. And so Twig will just kind of go item to item to item, and whichever the first one that has a value, it'll output that value. And so I can safely string together these variables that may or may not exist, and as long as I end with something that can be output to a template, then I'm safe. And so I can define a fallback to a fallback to a fallback, and I don't actually have to worry about whether any of those variables actually exist. So I find that extremely useful for just writing less code and writing more trustable code in my templates. And so I highly encourage everybody to become friends with the null coalescing operator, because it saves you so many, if something is defined and something has a property that is also defined and that property is not null, right? It saves you having to write all of those conditionals. And you can even, if you have, like an assets field, that may or may not have any assets in it, then I can say assets first URL. And if not, then I go to my global fallback assets field, and I look for its URL. And if I can't find that, then maybe I define some global template fallback to that. And so it'll actually, if entry or asset or its assets property or that first property or the URL property, like if any of that doesn't exist, then it very safely falls back to the next thing without throwing you any errors. And so that's a thing that, that I think is useful for getting around some of that just trouble.
Congratulations on getting that accepted into the core of Twig.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited. And it actually, I wrote a, I put up an issue and posted some code, but then actually Fabian, the creator of Twig, wrote his own implementation. So I can't take credit for the implementation that actually made it into Twig, but the functionality is coming to Twig, and I'm super excited about it. And until it does come to Craft, because Craft will have to update its version of Twig, you can go download the QQ plugin off of my GitHub, which is github/topshelfcraft. The other thing that I want to talk about real quick is a tool called PaperTrail. And this is maybe a little bit more esoteric, a little bit less broadly useful, but I use this tool, this web app called PaperTrail a ton. And so PaperTrail is an app that hooks into the logging systems on your servers and gives you a live feed of them inside this web app. But in addition to using this to monitor all of my servers, because you can do really cool things like filter the logs based on different processes or based on different systems, or if I want to search for the word invalid in any of my log files, so it just gives you a really, really nice view on all of your log files. I use
Are these log files different than what you'll find in storage runtime logs?
Yeah, so what I'm looking at this moment is actually like my system logs, my PHP logs, and my Nginx logs and all of that stuff. But I have actually hooked this tool. This is just a general log monitoring and searching tool that you can hook up to many servers, and then it aggregates all of the logs from all of those servers into this really nice web app interface that lets you search them and collate them and filter them. And so I've actually hooked up my craft logs to this tool as well, because if you've ever opened up the craft log, or really any log, you know that it gives you just a ton of data, and searching through a big log file for the thing that you're looking for, especially if you're in dev mode and craft is outputting every little thing that it does, can be a little bit time consuming. And so so I find this tool, PaperTrail, to be really, really useful for saving me time in just reading through all of my logs, my PHP error logs, my Nginx logs, my craft logs, because whenever you encounter an error in your template, there is an even more verbose explanation of that error in one of Craft's logs. And so actually what I did is I wrote a little plugin for PaperTrail where in my template I can log things to PaperTrail. And so this is my little demo template. I just call my PaperTrail plugin and I log something, and I can log a message and the severity of that message in case I want to search for only warnings or only errors or only info things, and then I can define a system that belongs to. And so here I'm going to log a warning that says warning, and I'm going to log a message that says hi everybody, and both of those they're going to have different severities, but they're both part of this template debug component, and that's just an arbitrary name that I gave to this component. But when I load this template, then you'll see here at the end of my log stream, I've got those logs popping up, and so I can actually filter using this app to only show things that belong to this arbitrary template debugging component. And so now I use this a lot of times. Instead of dumping something to the template, I'll use this plugin to log it to PaperTrail, and because it's live, I can stick my PaperTrail window, off to the side, and just every time I refresh a page, it just adds to the log, and so I don't have to, worry about breaking my layout with a bunch of, pre-formatted gobbledygook that represents a variable, and so.
I think logging also gives you the ability to set several messages throughout the conditionals of your code, so that
exactly.
when you're not just dumping one single point in time, you could actually dump variables throughout a conditional structure to understand how things are playing out a little bit better.
Yeah, and in some cases even, I've used this to monitor a live site. So I'll have, a trigger in a template that says, okay, if I try to load this template and some really important variable is missing, then throw an error and, pop up a message in my Slack so that I know, oh gosh, something went wrong in running this template and I should go look into that. And so live logging is really useful for a lot of things, but I'll admit to using it for a very quick and dirty way to just debug my templates while I'm building templates in exactly the same way as you used Twig's dump filter. Instead of using the dump filter, I just log stuff out to this live console, and then I'll just stick it off to the side while I'm building stuff, and I just kind of have a live feed of anything that I want to output in my template without actually having that information take up space in the layout that I'm building. So.
That's cool. And I've actually created a little log plugin too for similar things, just to doing it to the craft log. So just to comment to viewers here, that you can do this to the craft logs as well. You don't need to be using a separate service, but Michael's showing several reasons why the service kind of optimizes things. And to note, I do a lot of dumps, but I think they're the most explicit in demos because they're kind of real time, and you don't have to connect them to a separate system. So as much as I do use dumps, I agree with Michael that they're a little bit layman for more advanced debugging, and I'm all for them, and I think if you're new to debugging, use them all you can. You want to understand what's happening at different points in time in the page, and as you start to get a better understanding of that, you'll want to consider these more advanced logging options, because you get a lot more complexity, or you can interpret a lot more complexity these ways.
And there's lots of other apps that do exactly the same thing that PaperTrail does. I just happen to use this one, but the general concept is there are ways of getting that raw debugging information out of your template other than just dumping them into your template. And so if you just find yourself using a ton of dumps and writing them and erasing them and writing them and erasing them, then you might be a candidate for a more advanced tool like a live logger like this.
Well, great. We must have answered all the questions about troubleshooting in Twig. There's no questions in from the audience, so I think with that, I'm going to say, do either of you have any other things you want to say before we wrap up?
No, I'm glad we answered everybody's questions, and nobody's going to have any more trouble debugging from here on out.
We'll see the number of posts on Stack Exchange for Twig problems is going to decline.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely covered all of the ones that I, both in my own experience and in teaching other people, run into most commonly. So, yeah, I think props to you, because you covered just about everything.
Great. Well, and thanks for both of your inputs. I think there's a lot of little tips and tricks and clarifications in there that were very helpful to add in. So, great. With that said, then, this has been another Hangout, straight up Hangout. Thanks to Michael and Mariette for joining us this week. Next week we'll be back with another troubleshooting and debugging errors. Next week we'll be focusing on PHP a bit more, and we'll have the folks from Pixel and Tonic back joining us next week. So thank you for joining, and until next time.
See you later.
Bye.